Okay, guys, it is after 9:30. After 9:30. And so a couple of some housekeeping notes really quickly this morning as we get started. First off, thank you for Todd for covering last week so I could be home with Allison and Cameron and Jackson to be able to be a husband and a father to help them during the first couple of days as a two-child household. So thank you, Todd. That's why you said what you said. No. The second thing is we are going to go a little bit off script with the daily Bible reading over the next couple of weeks. The daily Bible reading, if you're still following along, keep doing it. I'm not saying don't do it, but there's a couple of lessons, a couple of readings in the Psalms which are incredible. But I'm saving a lot of the Psalms for a later time when we can dig deep into the Psalms and really think about the Psalms and what the writers are teaching us and kind of look at the Psalms from a collective rather than just like one or two really quickly. So we're going to skip over the Psalms over the next couple of weeks in our classes, and I want to focus in on a couple of lessons that we can learn from Saul, David, and Solomon. So we're really going to follow the life of Saul, David, and Solomon in our daily Bible reading over the next couple of weeks. We will get back on schedule, I think, toward the end of May. But the life of Saul and David and Saul, there are some really important lessons that we need to learn from those men. And so I want to dig into those stories together. When Todd left off last week, if my memory serves correctly, he got to about 1 Samuel 6, 1 Samuel 7. There's this crisis. The Philistines have come in and they've stolen the ark. And they finally sent it back with that weird story with all the tumors and all the stuff going on there. It's a really interesting story for a lot of reasons. But for 20 years there in 1 Samuel 7, the Israelites are oppressed. They are persecuted. They are controlled by the Philistines. And after 20 years of that, there in 1 Samuel chapter 7, the people of God come to Samuel, and the text says in verse 2, the whole house of Israel longed for the Lord. For 20 long years, they've been paying taxes, they've been paying tribute, they have been dealing with the Philistines as a thorn in their side, and they finally learned their lesson. And so they come to Samuel, and Samuel tells them there in verse 3, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then get rid of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths that are among you, and set your hearts on the Lord and worship only Him. Then He, God, will rescue you from the Philistines. And so there in the text, they get rid of all the idols, they get rid of the Ashtoreths, they get rid of the Baals. And they gather, and they fast, and they confess their sins. And the Philistines here, that Israel is all gathered together, like, hey, here's our chance. Let's give them a counterpunch. Let's get rid of these Israelites. And Samuel sees this. And Israel's worried because they see the Philistines massing. And they cry out to the Lord. And while Samuel was offering the burnt offering, as the Philistines are approaching in verse 10 to fight, the Lord thundered loudly, and the Philistines go into such confusion that they were defeated by Israel. This is very interesting, that Samuel is a judge who doesn't have to actually lead Israel in battle. He's offering the sacrifice, and God delivers Israel. God saves them. And in verse 13 it tells us that the Philistines were subdued and did not invade Israel again. And so Israel lived happily ever after, and they worshiped God and worshiped God completely and finally got the picture together, right? The next chapter tells us that when Samuel grows old, his sons did not walk in his ways. Does that sound familiar? A righteous man raising evil sons. We saw that with Eli. And the people of God come to Samuel in verse 5 and say, look, you are old, comforting words to hear, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have. Why did Israel want a king? And how does Samuel react there in 1 Samuel chapter 8? Yeah.
Well, I kind of don't want to go with the standard answer because everybody else had a king, although that definitely plays into it.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to kind of sign off on the last 400 years of this of God ruling through judges has not worked.
Yeah.
Because of the judges.
Yeah. Yeah.
Taking over. And honestly, yeah, it's a rejection of God, but it's also a rejection of the system of the abuses of these judges.
Yeah, I think connecting it back to the period of the judges, let's be honest. Those judges, although they were saviors, they were broken saviors. Most, if not all of those judges had some pretty serious falls. But I think what Todd points out there, that really deep down, this is a rejection of God. That Israel is looking at God and saying, we don't want you to fight our battles. We don't want you to be king over us. We want a king just like the world has. And that's what they get in Saul. In fact, Saul's name, if my memory serves correct, means one who has asked for something similar to that. And so Samuel is heartbroken there in the text that they've rejected God as their king. And God's like, look, they've been doing this since day one. They've been doing this for 400 years. Go ahead and give them the king they're looking for. A king just like all the nations around them. And so they get Saul there in 1 Samuel chapter 9. And as much as I want to dig into Saul, we are going to hit some highlights. There is so much here in Saul's life that we are just going to have to observe the Passover here today. But I do want to point out a couple of highlights. There in verse 2, that Saul is described as an impressive young man. There was no one more impressive among the Israelites than he. He stood a head taller than anyone else. What does that jump off the page to you? What do you notice about that description of Saul?
They were describing his physical stature, and that's, again, the whole idea of a king was they wanted a physical king instead of a spiritual king in God.
Yeah,
So
it's a
missing the point.
Yeah, it's a physical description that they're asking for a king like the nations, and so what does God do? You want a king like the nations? I'll give you one just like the Philistines have. I'll give you one just like the other Egyptians have. I'll give you a king just like the rest of the world has. And it's going to be focused on physical description. That this is a man, if we were to really, really dig deep into Saul's story here in the text, we would see that from the very beginning, there are some serious, serious flaws in Saul's life. And there in the text, he is appointed king. And there's this whole dialogue there, especially as Samuel says, look, this is what's going to happen. That you're going to be walking along and the Spirit of the Lord is going to come upon you. And when it does, you need to do everything that your heart finds to do. Everything you can. And guess what happens? The Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and there in chapter 10. And it came powerfully on him, except what he does rather than deliver the people from the crisis at hand is he goes home. He fails with his first commission. In fact, if you read 1 Samuel chapter 9 and 10, there are three really big flaws that you see there with Saul. Saul, the first king, doesn't know who Samuel is. Think about that. Samuel is the appointed prophet of God. He's the judge. He's the leader of God's people spiritually. And Saul has no clue who he is. So much so that when he sees him, it's like, who are you? What do I need to do? Saul doesn't seem to be one there in the story who seeks God himself. And third, he is a shepherd who has lost his animals. That kind of seems to be a foreshadowing of some things that we're going to see there in the text. And so Saul is appointed king, fails in that first commission to go do what he was supposed to do, and that kind of sets the stage for some things we'll see later in his story. There in 1 Samuel chapter 11, though, there's this guy named Nahash. Nahash the Ammonite. Now, does anybody here know what Nahash means in Hebrew? It means snake. Think about that as we read the story. So Nahash comes up and he lays siege to Jabesh Gilead. The snake, the Ammonite, the king, comes up. And so Saul saves them there in the text. You see that, and he comes, and to his credit there in chapter 11 and verse 13, he does give the Lord the credit. He says there in the text, "For today the Lord has provided deliverance for Israel." But there in Samuel's final speech, look what he says. As he's talking about and reviewing Israel's history, look what he says starting there in verse 10. "Then they cried out to the Lord, 'We have sinned, for we have abandoned the Lord and worshipped the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Now rescue us from the power of our enemies, and we will serve you.' And so the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Barak and Jephthah and Samuel, and he rescued you from the power of the enemies around you, and you live securely. But when you saw Nahash, the king of the Ammonites coming against you, you said, 'No, we must have a king to reign over us. We must have a king like the nations. We must have a king like the snake to reign over us and save us.'" That's interesting. That when they face the crisis with the Ammonites there at Jabesh Gilead, what they're looking for, what they really want, is a king like the serpent to save them. They don't look to God to save them. They look to the serpent. I think there's some little hints back to Eden. And there's a lot we could think about there, and I'm kind of surveying over for time reasons. Any thoughts or questions all the way to chapter 12 before we get to Saul's failure and his fall? Yeah.
Did God God's the one who chose Saul.
Mm-hmm.
Was he setting Saul up for failure?
Here's my opinion. This is one of those times in Scripture where God goes, "You want that? Okay, you can have it." And God knows in his wisdom that this is going to fail. And what you're going to see in the Saul story, in the Saul-David story, this is again my opinion, is they ask for a king like the nations. God gives them a king like the nations. And when he fails, he's going to say, "Okay, let me give you a king after my own heart. Let me give you a king like I intended my people to have," all the way back in Deuteronomy 17. Because the request to ask for a king was not an unbiblical request. All the way back in Deuteronomy 17, Moses, before he dies, says, when you ask for a king, this is the kind of king you need. This is what a king should do. Saul does not follow Deuteronomy 17. We see that in David. Does that answer your question at all? I'm hesitant to say, did God set up Saul to fail? I do think it's one of those times, and those of you who have gone through the season of parenting maybe know this, have experienced this, that when your kids come and say, "Can I do this?" You go, "I don't think you should do this. This is not smart. In fact, this may be stupid. But I'm going to let you do it so you can experience failure and you learn from this." I don't know if your parents did that. Maybe you did it as a parent at some point in time. I can think of a couple of times where I feel like my parents were like, "This is not going to work out well, but go make the mistake and learn from it." Again, I think that's kind of what's going on here. There in the text. Yeah.
I do think there's as you're saying this, I think there's a lesson, though, that kind of masks this idea of free will. And I think that even if God in his wisdom can see
Yeah.
out of time and across the board, what's going to happen. It can do some foreshadowing
Yeah.
to David and to Jesus. At the same time, I think he has an optimism always that people are going to do his will.
Yeah.
And so in that case, what you don't see him doing is, I mean, he's not throwing any burden in the way
No.
of Saul being the king that he needs to be,
Yeah.
even though he doesn't fulfill it.
Yeah. I won't argue with that. I think God, never wants his people to fail. He gives them everything they need to succeed. And he has that ability. And it's something I think, something that's hard for us to fathom in our finite human minds is the wisdom, the infinite wisdom of God. And the way Chris said it, to see beyond time and space and kind of see the whole picture. God can see some things we can't. God knows some things we can't. But God also allows us to have free will to choose. And Saul chooses repeatedly in his life to go against God's word. Starting there in 1 Samuel chapter 13, when there's this conflict again with the Philistines. And Samuel is supposed to show up, but after 7 days, Samuel hasn't. And the troops are in caves, they're in thickets, they're among rocks. In verse 6, they're among cisterns. They've crossed the Jordan, they are fleeing, they are running for their lives. The king that they wanted for safety and security, well, guess what? They have it and they are still scared. And Saul looks around and goes, man, it's been 7 days. And Samuel's supposed to be here to offer that sacrifice. So we could offer a sacrifice before we go to war so God would give us luck. It's like a rabbit's foot for him. And so he calls for the sacrifice. He offers it. And when Samuel sees him, he goes, what have you done? Samuel knows what's going on. And look how Saul answers there in verse 11. Chapter 13 and verse 11. When I saw the troops were deserting me, that's excuse number 1, and you didn't come in the appointed time, that's excuse number 2, and the Philistines were gathering at Michmash, that's excuse number 3. There was a real crisis, and because there was a real crisis, Samuel, I had no choice. I forced myself, verse 12, to offer the burnt offering. And Samuel says to Saul, you have been foolish. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that God would have permanently established your reign, would have given you a dynasty, a Saul dynasty, where his son Jonathan would be the next king. But now, your reign will not endure. That the Lord has found a man after his heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not done what is commanded. And there in chapter 14, Jonathan does gain this victory over the Philistines. That even though his father is a godless man, a man who doesn't really care about God or God's commands, and treats God and serving God almost like a rabbit's foot, a good luck charm, Jonathan does seem to be a man who loves God and cares for God and serves God and has faith in God. And there in the text, understands, especially there in verse 6, chapter 14 and verse 6, at the end of the verse, perhaps the Lord will help us. Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Jonathan understood that no situation is hopeless when the Lord is your God. And at the end of the chapter, or toward the end, we find out that the Lord did in fact save Israel that day. And then there in chapter 15, Saul is rejected again. He's told to utterly destroy the Amalekites. The Amalekites had been a thorn in the side of the people of Israel, going all the way back to the Exodus account. And now it's their time to be destroyed. And Saul is told to kill everyone. And so he goes and kills everyone and everything, well, except for the king and the best of the flock. And Samuel shows up and goes, And Saul comes out to Samuel and goes, hey, I obeyed the Lord's command. I did what you told me to. And Samuel's like, then why do I hear cows mooing? What about the lambs baaing? And who's that guy with the crown over there? What's he doing here? He's like, oh, well, the people kept that. And Samuel looks at him there in verse 22. Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And Saul offers this kind of vague confession, attempting to make things right. But he finds out that this kingdom has been torn away from him. And so what can we learn from Saul's failures as king there in 1 Samuel 13 through 15? As you were reading those chapters, what jumped out to you? What things can we learn from Saul's failures there in those 2 or 3 chapters? Yeah.
I think this parallels with what you were saying, that he kind of looked at God as a rabbit's foot
Yeah.
or whatever. But what jumped out at me was when he said, nobody's going to eat anything.
Yeah.
You know, they had a hard day, and he's saying, you're not going to eat anything until we have victory.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Jonathan breaks that rule without knowing, and it just it struck me as he was impulsive.
He's impulsive, but when he makes this rash vow, and Jonathan breaks this vow, he's prepared to kill his only son because of the rash vow he made. And it's the men, the people of Israel, it's the soldiers, it's the army who have to step up and go, wait a second here. We're not going to do this to Jonathan today. And the people redeem Jonathan, not Saul, the people. Saul doesn't recognize his rash vow. The vow he makes, I think, as a kind of ritual thing. Look how holy I am. I'm going to deprive myself and my army of food so God will give us the victory. Saul is obsessed with ritual, not obedience, and you see that kind of throughout his story. What other lessons can we learn about Saul and his fellow? Yeah.
So Saul is arrogant narcissist.
Yes.
And when we find this out, and I think he's kind of has self-made, has made himself into that.
Yeah.
But I think what we find with a leader like that is that they will believe that they can take the place of God. That there is nobody more important to than them, including God. And so he behaves as if he is God. He makes these decisions that are God's decisions.
Yeah. I like what you said there, that he is an arrogant narcissist. If you know anything about the ancient kings, or the kings of the ancient Near East, most of them were arrogant narcissists. You can tell story after story of them being arrogant. And you see those same characteristics in Saul. Yeah, Rob.
Todd trying to mention this, but it didn't start out this way. When he was supposed to be anointed as king, he was hiding in the baggage, right? I mean, he was rather humble to begin with, and power seems to have corrupted him.
Yeah. I'll actually take a little different spin on him hiding, depending on your translation. Some say hiding among the stuff, which is a really eloquent translation when you think about it. I kind of think this is not a mark, or that is not a mark of humility. It's another example of Saul not doing what he was supposed to do. That he was supposed to be present, to be anointed king, so he would deliver Israel, and he's not. He's disobeying God. Again, that's the way I read it. I've often been told that, so I'm not going to quibble. It's just an interesting kind of, tension in Saul's story. Yeah, Chris.
There's two charges against him in chapter 15 that Samuel brings. He says, rebellion and presumption lead to rejection.
Mm-hmm.
Rebellion like divination, presumption like idolatry.
Yeah.
And I think that I get rebellion. I think I'm a little less thoughtful when it comes to presumption.
Yeah.
But yet that's what those are the two charges against him. So for myself, right, I there's a lot of times where I'm thinking, well, this is what God would want.
Mm-hmm.
But unless God says it's what he wants, it's not what God
Yeah.
wants.
Yeah.
And so, but presumption is one of those things that we don't often go to and say, oh, that could be a sin.
Yeah. That's important for us to kind of think about. And as we look at really the total reason for Saul's rejection as king, when you really boil it down, it goes back to Saul rejecting God at every turn. That nothing less of strict and total obedience, whether that's submission to the word and obedience, or that's even jumping into presumption, is acceptable to God.
I was going to say total obedience is not partial obedience. I can't decide what I
Yeah.
think is right to follow
Yeah.
and then do what I think is right, which is
Yeah.
do the
Yeah.
whole thing away with obedience. And it goes back to there's a way that we as men make our
Yeah.
decisions, and it leads to destruction.
Yeah. And you see it right here in Saul's life. So we're going to skip ahead to some new stuff for today. There in 1 Samuel 16 through 31, kind of surveying that section of Saul's decline and David's rise there in the text. What are some key moments as you were reading that over the last couple of weeks that you noticed there in 1 Samuel 16 through 31? Well, what jumped off to you as you're reading probably some familiar stories to some of us there, especially that story of David and Goliath? What are some key moments that you noticed, some key things, key themes? Yeah.
Verse 7, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Yeah. Yes. That's the second time we've seen that, a reference to David's heart or the next king's heart, a couple chapters over. There in chapter 13. The Lord has found a man after his own heart. There in verse 7, the Lord sees the heart. The Lord cares about the heart. There's this interesting scene there in chapter 16 where Samuel shows up at Jesse's house. And by the way, who is Jesse a descendant of? We read about her a couple weeks ago. Ruth. Shows up at Jesse's house and he goes, hey, I'm here today. And I'm going to appoint the next king. I'm summarizing some things. And they bring all the sons out except for David. And Samuel's like, I need all of them. Go get David in from the field. And so David is brought in, and he's appointed king of Israel. And the Spirit of the Lord, verse 13, came powerfully on David from that day forward. Well, what happens at that time? Verse 14. The Spirit of the Lord that had come upon Saul to do his work and lead the people, at the very beginning of Saul's reign, it now leaves Saul. And an evil spirit comes and torments Saul. So yeah, you see right there in chapter 16 a glimpse at David's heart. What else do you see?
I think it's just interesting. I mean, there's so much in these passages, but the fact that, again, the evil
Yeah.
spirit or, the dealings that Saul has to go with, he needs someone to soothe his spirit, right? And that becomes David.
Yeah.
And that whole timeline of, again, how he soothes his soul while
Yeah.
still working for his father, I guess, in the shepherds, and then
Yeah.
delivering so that he can take on Goliath. I mean, that whole timeline is just so interesting,
Yeah.
how God played that through. I
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
it's staggering.
Yeah, like 1 Samuel 16 through 31 really contrasts Saul and David on so many levels. You see David as the guy who's in Saul's presence, soothing Saul. I think I got my names right there. But at the same time, Saul is losing his mind and is trying to kill David at every turn. And David, on multiple occasions, passes up the opportunity to kill Saul and go ahead and seize control. What else did y'all notice there in 1 Samuel 16 through 31? Anything else? Any other interesting stories? What? There's a lot of interesting stories, let's be honest.
Just going off of what you were just talking about with David, and he had that respect for the Lord's anointed one.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
self-defense didn't seem to matter.
No.
It was just, who's gonna honor that
yeah.
position.
And I want us to keep how David looks at Saul and how David respects Saul. I want you to keep all of this in mind for another week. We're going to deal with it and we're going to look at it next week. Because David's reactions to Saul's death in 2 Samuel 1 is really, really interesting to me. We're going to, yeah.
So the interesting part about Saul is when David did have those opportunities and made Saul aware that he could have
Yeah.
killed him, Saul had some remorse, but it was so short-lived, right? It was just like, don't you remember from...
Yeah. And that's the thing. Saul's hot and cold. He is. I hesitate to throw this word out there because it has connotations even for our world today. But Saul comes across as almost schizophrenic or bipolar or something like that. He has almost like two different personalities here in the story. Because of what you see, especially, you are more righteous than I. Why am I killing you? Except that, what do we read the next chapter over? He's trying to kill him. Like, it's just weird. Yeah.
Well, it just popped it into me that this statement in verse 15 is played out, or in chapter 15 is played out in 16 through 31. Because all of us, at one point or another, I'm assuming, and I am assuming this, said at some point, well, surely David would be justified. He's rejected Saul. He's anointed a new king in David. And this pursuit of God's anointed by somebody who's been rejected, surely David should be comfortable taking his life. But David doesn't presume what God's thinking.
Yeah.
He knows what God's done, and he's going to respect that.
Yeah.
And that's the character contrast.
And I love that you bring that up, because when you think about this pursuit section that you look at, and really this question almost echoes the one we've been dealing with, or at least the answers that we've been talking about, that Saul opposes God at every turn. And yet David, on the other hand, even when his life is on the line, even when he's living in caves, even when his life is a mess as he lives on the run from Saul, for the most part, he has his moments where I think we can question if his faith was what it needs to be. David seems to submit to God and to follow God through those difficult things. He is an imperfect, but a man who's trying to be that covenantal king, the king that God wants. Yes?
David doesn't have to kill Saul. David was anointed before he even fought Goliath.
Yeah.
David had the Spirit of the Lord with him from the point where he was anointed. David's personality, in my opinion, is such that he knew that there was no way that Saul could kill him. Saul was never a threat to David. Saul may have been a threat to the population that was following David, but Saul was never a threat to David. David knew that.
Yeah.
Which I like the boldness of David, because that, if you look at it that way, when I look at it that way, I see a much bolder person. I mean, he's bold because he knows that God's with him,
Yeah.
and nobody can touch him. And, man, isn't that true of us too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, there's a phrase later in the Saul story, Saul David's story, there in chapter 18, actually, which we're probably not going to look at in deep detail, where over and over it tells us that Saul is afraid of David 3 times in some form or fashion, but it also tells us that the Lord is with, or was with David. And you see, as Todd is pointing out, David's faith, that David knows that though God is with him, that it's God's plan for him to become king, and he trusts God to do it on God's time. That he doesn't have to take measures into his own hands. Yes.
I was thinking that this is kind of a good example of having faith even the size of a mustard seed,
Yeah.
how well it can take you
Yeah.
in your life. You don't have to know everything, you don't have to rely on other things, just rely on God and have faith, and this will carry you through.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the importance of faith in David's life cannot be understated. That is the reason that he is called the man after God's own heart. Is he had a faith the size of a mustard seed.
Maybe you or Todd could answer this. When I was reading all this, what really struck me is, I mean, Todd's into animals too. David, he had the Spirit of God, right?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out, he killed that lion and bear before he knew he killed Goliath, because a lion could have killed Goliath.
Yeah.
He was a 9-foot guy,
Yeah.
you know. But you think he killed the lion and bear after he was anointed as a shepherd?
That's a
How do you
great
kill
question.
a lion and a bear without having the Spirit of God with you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those things you got to wonder, like, if you're David and you're a shepherd and you're looking out one day and there's a lion, how many of us are grabbing our spear? And how many of us are saying, okay, that's just one lamb, I'm going to run for my life? I don't know about you, but if I see a lion,
I'd rather
I'm
face
staying
the
inside.
lion than a lion.
I see a cougar running my neighborhood in Bellevue one day, I am 100% keeping my kids and my dog and my wife. We are staying inside until that cougar is caught. And he killed a bear too. And I've seen a bear. I've seen a black bear. I've been the distance between me and Ray and a black bear in the wild. It scares the tar out of you. And some of you who hunt have probably been even closer. It's scary. Yeah, Todd.
So, and it's kind of funny too, I've actually, 2001, was attacked by a grizzly bear, but
Okay. Speaking of being close to a bear.
I was just watching this thing, it was like last week, Jim, on the power that a sling has,
Yeah.
and they said it's about the same as a 45 ACP, and they were taking this thing, and these guys are so good with it, and they were just smoking watermelons, just blow it out
Yeah.
at a decent range, like 50 yards.
Yeah.
And I know that in Sunday school, we all hear about how the rock didn't kill Goliath, that David had to cut his head off.
Yeah.
No, he was dead when the rock hit him. Text says so.
Yeah.
Well, my question is, well, why did he bring 5 stones then?
Yeah. There's a
Brothers.
so
Goliath had
Rise,
brothers.
brothers.
yeah. There's a lot of things like I think I read somewhere suggested that there were 5 cities, and again, this is someone suggesting. I think it's interesting. I'm not sure I buy into it. That there's 5 stones because there were 5 key cities of the Philistines, and this symbolized knocking down the 5 key cities. Like I'm like, okay, that's a little allegorical for me, but yeah, why did he bring 5? I don't know. The Bible tells me so. But you're right. I think the interesting thing about the slingshot is we think of the little slingshots we play with as little boys with paper wads. I think this was something David had a lot of time to practice when he was in the fields with the sheep. Was probably pretty good at slinging some stones. Yeah.
Diversion here.
Yeah.
The other thing that stood out with me in this text is, even though Saul was pursuing David, there was this relationship between David and Jonathan that endured through this entire time.
Yeah.
That is so beautiful, that you know,
Yeah.
hopefully you don't ignore that.
No, I wish we had time to dive into that, because that story, how Jonathan is able to work past David. I mean, think about what David means to Jonathan. Jonathan knows that David's the next king. Jonathan knows that if David's the next king, then he's not the next king. And yet, he reaches across the aisle and says, let's be friends. I think when you look at the story, it's my opinion that Jonathan's probably 10 or 15 years older. That this is not two guys within the same couple years apart. When you read the story, I tend to get the impression that Jonathan is the one taking the initiative to be a friend. That Jonathan is the one who's taking the initiative to form it and to be the person he needs to be, to recognize that, David, you're going to be the next king, and I'm going to do what I can to support you. I see two hands coming up.
One thing, Saul's character, you know, David could have killed him
Yeah.
a few times. Saul would then feel bad about it and then immediately forget and try to,
Yeah.
you know, kill David again. I mean, the guy flip-flopped back and forth constantly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's why I say he's kind of bipolar and kind of schizo. Not to diminish people who may struggle with that today, but it just, when you read it, it's just back and forth.
Well, Saul's flock lost.
Yeah.
Had no idea where they were. David's flock, he's protecting them,
Yeah.
right? He's gonna put his life on the line for his flock. That's a man after God's own
Yeah.
heart.
And not to get too far ahead of us in the David story, but doesn't David in that kind of anticipate the good shepherd, the one who would put his life on the line for his sheep? Really quickly, before we wrap up today, because we are getting up against the clock right now, at the very end in 1 Samuel chapter 28, there's this interesting story where Saul goes to the medium at Endor, not the Star Wars planet. It's a city, a village, and seeks wisdom from a medium, from a witch. And what's interesting is the story tells us there that Saul had removed the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Saul did something good. Let's be honest. We've been criticizing Saul most of today. But Saul had enough forethought and willingness to obey God's word that he did at least do that. But there was this one that was apparently less, so he disguises himself. He goes out and he consults the medium. What you see here, mediums were really big in Canaanite religion. So what you see here, much like Achan, several hundred years beforehand, who takes the Canaanite stuff and becomes a Canaanite, Saul in many ways is becoming a Canaanite here. And there's this discussion there, and Saul asks for the medium to bring up Samuel, and so she does. And what's interesting there is that the woman freaks out when Samuel comes up. She sees the spirit form or the God or whatever your translation says there in the text, and is just completely loses her mind, which makes me wonder how often she was successful at bringing up spirits. And Saul goes and sees Samuel, kneels before Samuel. And in verse 15, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And he's like, hey, the Lord isn't listening to me. And it was like, here's why. You never listen to the Lord. There comes a point in our time, and here's a really important lesson for us to understand. Comes a point in time that if we stop listening to the Lord, if we stop obeying God's word, we're going to endure God's silence. That God will not listen to us because we have turned away from him. And so when we think about this story, why is it significant, and what does it reveal about Saul's spiritual condition at the end of his life? This is like, Saul's got 24 hours left to live at this point. What does it reveal about his spiritual condition? I'm seeing some head shaking. It's not in a good spot. Yeah, let's just put it that way. That earlier, in his life, he had rejected those. He had pushed them all out. Now he's accepted them. They're okay. Saul is not in a good place spiritually. What we see so often in our lives, in the lives of people we love and we care for, is they start making a series of small compromises. Chris pointed out earlier, they make presumptions that the Lord would be okay with this. They make a couple of times in their life where they don't completely obey. They partially obey. And by the end of their life, spiritually they're a wreck. That's what we see sometimes in our lives, in the lives of our friends, in the lives of our family members, in the life of people we care about, and that's what we see here in the life of Saul. And so what I want us to think about going into next week is David. And so I will send out some questions early mid this week with some questions on 1 Samuel 1, or 2 Samuel 1, probably through about 15 or so. And those questions should go out as soon as I can get them out to you. That way you can kind of prep and go through it. And we'll look at David next week, or the week after. I think Daryl's coming next week. So Daryl will be here the week after next week. And then so we'll look at David, and then we're going to look at Solomon, and we should be back on track by then, give or take. So it's been fun. I enjoyed going over Saul with you guys. We'll be in David in 2 weeks. Daryl will be here next week. So on that, class dismissed.